Eric.
Hubert.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to this webinar session of KBV SRB. Today, we will be introducing you to the KBV SRB 2.0, the new perimeter of our organization. My name is Joachim Govaerts, and I will quickly do the introduction for you, after which I will give the word to our President, Frédéric Dunon. So very welcome, everyone. Please do not take any recordings of this session. Now we will do a recording ourselves. So in a minute, you will also see that the recording has started. But you will also be able to see this recording afterwards directly in the Teams. So the agenda of today, we will have Frédéric, our president, who is starting with the presentation of the new perimeter of KBV SRB, and who will also present the different main teams that we will speak of, after which he will also present briefly the operational team of KBV. Afterwards, the pillar owners will go into a bit more detail on the different pillars that we address in the years 2022-2023. And after which we have a very fine guest speaker, Jos Delbeke, who will talk to us about the evolution of European ETS. After the presentation of Jos, you will be able, or we will be able to address some questions to him, so there will be Q&A. So please already feel free to put all your questions in the chat. We will take them up with Jos. Also questions on the perimeter of KBVE and of the different pillars can be addressed already there. After this Q&A, Danielle Adam, our chair of the technical committee, the scientific and technical committee, will present the program, the agenda for 2022-2023, after which we can close the event. But of course, if any questions should arise, please put them in the chat. We will, of course, treat these. So I'm happy to give the word to Frédéric. Hello, Frédéric.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Joachim, for the introduction. And it's not yet too late. I'm still in January. I wish for all of you an happy new year. My hope for KVB that we will have more opportunity to interact also physically and with all our members. Then we will see how it will evolve with the COVID, but that's certainly the ambition of KVB to organize some physical event also, but we come on that later on today on the agenda. What I would like to discuss with you, or to present to you today, is the reflection we did the last months at KVB, how we have to reorganize ourselves to stay relevant for you as members, but also for our stakeholders in the energy transition. And we start with the context. What is changing around us, and I think it's not new for you, but we see an acceleration. If we go on the next slide, we see an acceleration with the European Commission really pushing a lot to decarbonize much faster than it was foreseen in the past. And what is also new since the Green Deal is that all the sectors will have to decarbonize. There is no free lunch anymore. And you see, and the last I would say 2-3 years, a lot of dynamics at all in all sectors, in mobility, in industry, which was not seen in the past. And it will also be interlinked. What is the impact of mobility on electrical system? What is the complementarity of gas system and electrical system? All the part of the energy system are more and more interrelated. Just to give an example, if we go on the next slide, one of the conclusions and some examples of the conclusions of the ongoing work for 55 and the package which is for the moment ongoing at EU Commission, and the objective is to reduce the green gas emission by 55% by 2030. And you see this going faster and is broader than what was foreseen in the past. And there is some examples here on the slide. Energy efficiency, the objective is much higher than in the past. Integration of renewable in the final energy mix is higher than in the past. There is a push to give the right incentives to the industry to decarbonize with the evolution of the ETS that Jos Delbecq will explain much more in detail in the next presentation. Also for the taxation, how to give the right incentive to use the right energy carriers for your activities. It is also developed for the moment in this package. Also some examples to make the mobility of the e-mobility happening. There will be some binding targets to install all the infrastructure needed to recharge the electrical vehicles. And all these elements you feel, it is faster, it is broader, and it is binding for some of the elements, and that gives really a dynamic in the system around us. And that's basically, if you can summarize that in a few elements, all these packages, the order of the way that this thought about these four main pillars. It is one, this on the next slide, that is one, this efficiency. All what you don't have to use is basically not to be made renewable, and that you have to focus on energy efficiency as first principle. Second, minimum regret, this RES integration. Of course, you will need some backup capacities, some thermal capacities in the future, which will also have to be decarbonized towards 2050. But RES integration is clearly a no regret. Third one, direct electrification. All activities, all applications that you can electrify, you have to do it. It is the most efficient way to decarbonize the system. And the fourth element, the fourth principle is use the carbon neutral molecules for activities that you cannot directly electrify. That's the order of thinking that you find back in all these legislative documents. Now the question was, okay, that's the context rapidly set. What is now the impact for us as an association? And there, what we see on the next slide, of the slide after, is basically we don't want to adapt our fundament. We have three main pillars for decades: knowledge sharing, technical value, and networking, and that has to stay. The objective of the association is to share knowledge between our members, to interact with external stakeholders. It is also technical value. We are a neutral organization. We are not pushing for nuclear or for renewable. We want to have neutral position, but we want to have some debates. And we don't want to have some buzzwords or some small statement on Twitter. We want to have real debates between experts to better understand which are the trade-offs that we have to do from a technical and economical point of view. And third, but not least, networking, how we offer platform and opportunities to people to interact. And like we showed in the previous slide, basically it will be much more integrated, all the elements of the energy supply chain. Then networking is even more important in the past because the system has become much too complex. It will be only able to solve it, to work on that together by interacting, by interlinking all the different pieces of the puzzle. That is basically the main foundation we had in the past that we want to keep in the evolution of the organization. Now the question is, what do we want to change on the organization to be more relevant for you as members? And that's basically on the next slide. Yeah, the next slide. Yeah, we have five. We decide to organize our transformation around five main topics. First one, I think this was already quite clear in my introduction, It is the E of KVBE, of SRBE. It was for electricity in the past. It will become energy. It means we want to have a broader view on the different elements of the supply chain in the energy landscape. It doesn't make sense anymore to look only on electricity. Everything is interlinked, like I said, mobility with electricity, gas and electricity, which are there, the trade-off that we want to make. Everything is much more integrated, interlinked than it was in the past. Looking only to electricity is much too narrow if we want to understand the best option for managing the energy transition. First element. Second element, diversity, and diversity in different aspects. First, in the way we organize the events, we understood from the feedback we received that only organizing study days is not relevant for all our members or potential members. Then we want, of course, to keep the study days as a cornerstone in our program, but also to organize other kind of events, like today, the webinars, which is much more agile than spending a whole day on one topic. But also some more late afternoon or evening events to give the opportunity to other people to attend and interact on this kind of topics. That's the diversity on the way we organize the event. There's also the diversity in the members and the speakers we want to attract. We see that there are some new competences needed to support the energy transition. It's not only technical electrical engineers that we need, but also some new competencies, often coming with new generation, like all about digitalization. And these competencies are even more important today than in the past, because to manage the whole system, which is much more decentralized, we will need to add digitalization to interact in a digital way with all these devices to support an efficient and safe management of the system. And these new kind of competencies have also to be integrated in our thinking when we develop the study days, but also in our networking with our members and stakeholders we want to interact with. Just a small word on that for the new generation. We decide also to be quite concrete to install or to develop a new committee and a new generation committee, which is led by Joachim, to develop a tactical approach, how to better interact, how to better attract these new generation that we are not used to work with the last years in the SRB. Third pillar, this internationalization. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. What can we learn from what is going on abroad? How we can better interact with external international parties, how we can benefit with what is going on in other organizations like NSOE, like International Energy Agency, and this kind of organization we can bring added value to our thinking, and we can interact with to develop some of the debate about future scenarios that we should consider when taking some decisions. Fourth pillar, this we had in the past and still today a strong network. And if we look at all the companies present in our membership, we have quite a lot of diversity, and that we want to keep that. And like I said, also for diversity, we want even to make it broader. Why? Because we have a good network, but it's more, I would say, the historical companies active in the sector, and we have to diversify that to the new actors that are now present in the energy landscape, or that will come in the future, to have a broader perspective to the energy transition. And again, it is not only industrial backbone and network, and we are not a lobby organization, to say it like that. We want all what we discuss to be backed by academic background. And that's also why we reinforce our link with universities. You will see also in the operational team, there are now 3 professors from university attending, and that's important. We want to stay neutral. We want to have real in-depth discussions on the content, and not to have some, like I often say, some buzzword on some small tweet on Twitter. And it is fine. It is needed to influence the society, but here we want also to go in the depth to have some good debate about the topic we want to address. Last topic, I mentioned that already before, it is the cooperation with other associations to organize the events or to attract some special guests or some special speakers in our conferences. We did already some exercise last year with the French association S2E, and we have now in our operational committee NSOE attending, and also International Energy Agency attending in the operational team. And these are the kind of association we want to work with, we want to reinforce the cooperation with. If we go on the next slide, and that's just to present the operational team and to demonstrate that we walk the talk. If you look at the people here present in the operational team, it is quite diverse compared to the past. And I have to say I'm quite fier of the team I have here on the slide. You see three professors: Ronnie Belmans from KU Leuven, Patrick Hendricks from ULB, and you see also François Vallée from UMons. In the board of directors, we have also Emmanuel de Jager from UCL. Then we can say from an academic point of view, we have a quite good representation in the governance of the KVB. Also from the industry, we have Hubert Lemmens, which is a former member of the executive committee of ELIA. We have Daniel Ladan, which is a former worker at a chemical and petrochemical company. We have also Jean-Luc Guérin, which is active at Hitachi now, and that's the new name of the former ABB. And if also association, like I said, with Bruno Gouverneur, former in the past active as at Cinegrid and the Federation of the Grid Operators in Belgium, and now active within NSOE. And we have also Jacques Warichet, which is working at International Energy Agency for a few years. On the right side, we have also two invited that are not formally part of the bureau, but quite important in our day-to-day organization. And we have Georges Van Gouten, which was formerly active at the European Commission, more in the R&D activities, a lot of contact with universities, and Joachim Govaerts, which is a technical expert at ELIA. And indeed myself, a member of the executive committee of ELIA. No, the last slide for my part, that's also a new way of organizing our events. And we decide to move from, I would call that, a more plick-plock way of organizing the event. We had in the past quite opportunistic way to select the topics. Now we decide to have a more structured way to organize all our activities. And we decide to define 4 main pillars. And each of the pillars will organize their own events, but there will be some linked, and we want to make some journey with our members to go through some reflections topics more in the detail. And the 4th pillar are one energy outlook, to have a better understanding of which are the possible scenarios which will influence the policies and influence the decision that we will have to make in the next years. Second, decarbonize the load. Like I said before, all the sector will have to decarbonize. What does it mean for each sector? Which are the maturity of the technologies? Is it economical? Yes or no? Or they will interact with the broader system? That's the topics we will address in the decarbonize the load pillar. Of course, we have to supply the load. What does it mean in terms of generation? We will have much more integration of renewable. The thermal power plant will be needed to complement renewables. They will also have to decarbonize towards 2050. Or we will transport, what is the impact on the grid and transport grid, but also distribution grid from an infrastructure point of view, technological point of view, but also from a system point of view. How will digitalization help us to manage the systems? That does make part of the 3rd pillar. And the last one, how the markets design will need to evolve to support the decarbonization of the load and to support the integration of the new kind of generation into the system. That's the 4th pillar. And all our program will be organized based on this 4th pillar. For each of the pillars, there are 2 people from the operational team in charge to organize the different events. And I think that Joachim and Daniel will come back on that later on the agenda today. So far, my introduction. I give you the floor, Joachim.
Yes, thank you. I will go a bit more into detail on these three first pillars, and then Hubert will come back on the last pillar with a bit more information on that one. So as for the first pillar, the energy outlook, and the legislative packages. So of course, as the slide mentions, in both climate and energy fields, we have very long lead times. It's important to mention that these lead times are quite long already for implementation of the entire system, for having the systems in place, having the necessary infrastructure built. But of course, first there has to be a policy. Of course, policy making can also take some time. And therefore, the objective of this pillar is to provide or to give more clarity on the different long-term scenarios that are built by different organizations. And one that is very known is the International Energy Agency, of which, by the way, we see here on the bottom left of the slide a future outlook for the necessary carbon or the decarbonization of our system that is necessary by 2050 in the different scenarios. So what these associations do is build these long-term scenarios, and we want to share these with all of you to give some more information on that in order to be able to support our different stakeholders into navigating these long-term scenarios into first policies, but also into roadmaps of their own into carbon neutrality in the future, and that on a global level, on a European level, and of course also on a Belgian level. And we also want to show them what are the implications of these roadmaps. And the second objective is also then to analyze how these policies and different instruments that are in place can support these long-term strategies, but also what are the constraints and what are the uncertainties that we still have today. That's a bit on the first pillar. So two main reports that exist there are the World Energy Outlook by the International Energy Agency, another one that is made by Elia Group on the roadmap to 2050, and of course a lot of organizations are now building their own outlooks, and we want to give clarity on all these different outlooks and to show what are the differences, where do we have the same outlooks, etc. So that's a bit on the first pillar. On the second pillar, we have decarbonize the load. So the first pillar is basically really the one that we, it's the basis, and the other three pillars follow a bit upon that first pillar. The decarbonize the loads pillar will then mention it specifically on the decarbonization, of course. How can we decarbonize the different loads? It will investigate sector by sector how we can make these emissions decrease in a very drastic way, because we see that a drastic way is necessary to be able to reach the net zero by 2050 in the different sectors. As we can see here, especially in electricity and heat, for example, there is a big decrease that has to be made, but also in industry, in transport, also a bit in buildings. So this pillar will investigate how to do that. It will investigate the different options. It will mention, or it will investigate how mature these options are today, how realistic it is to be implementing them in the upcoming years, and also the economic aspect, how profitable might these options be going to the future, but also today, if we have to make investments, what might it cost to be able to, for our stakeholders to make good decisions on the options that they would prefer. We will investigate in the entire system what would be the energy needs linked to this decarbonization, which energy carriers should be available to fulfill the needs that would exist. How do these different energy carriers need to interact with each other, and also how do we integrate it in the system, and also in the management of the system. So that's about the second pillar. Then if you go to the third pillar is strictly on one carrier, the electricity, and it concerns both production and then transport and distribution. So on one hand, as we saw, there is this need for decarbonization. So there might be a switch in, the different carriers, but electricity, of course, will be probably even the main, as Frederik mentioned, the main carrier going to the future, specifically in certain industries and transport, etc. So here in this pillar, we will investigate going to 2050, what will the needs be for the electricity system? What challenges do we see going ahead? What will be the electricity mix? As we see here, the outlook for the International Energy Agency shows that we will probably have more than double the amount of electricity in the system by 2050, and that's almost 70% of this electricity by 2050 will be provided by wind and solar. So that is a huge challenge to go there. And we see in the intermediate phase that there is still fossil electricity as well, fossil production as well. So this pillar will show us how to go from what we have today to the future with a specific look on the technical part and how can it be implemented, what are the systems behind it, but especially the technologies behind it. On the production side, but of course it also has a big impact on the need for grid modifications and grid enhancements. So how can we manage that there? For example, renewables have a completely different impact on grid stability than the systems that we have in place today with rotating machinery. How can we manage that? How can we make sure that we have a reliable grid that is safe and that provides the electricity as we want? And we see here as well that huge grid investments will be necessary going to 2050 with a specific impact from just only the increased demand. So that's a bit on the third pillar where we will have quite some events. We look at wind and solar, so directly renewable energy, but we will also look at what might be a nuclear future, not only in Belgium, but in different countries as well. What are the different emerging technologies? Also with carbon, with the CRM and the gas turbines, etc. Offshore digitalization, as Frederik mentioned, very important. The smart grids, HVDC, which is especially for the interconnections, and more interconnected grids requires more interconnections, and those are often done today in HVDC. How can we maintain the grid stable, and how can also energy storage help in keeping our electricity or in meeting our electricity needs? That was on the third pillar, and then now I would like to give the word to Hubert to explain you a bit more on the fourth pillar on market design and pricing options.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being with us, and I would like to give some more details about what we think about market design, pricing options, and why it's important in the objectives of KBVE SRBE. It goes without saying that the energy transition comes with new ways of consuming energy. I think that we will see more and more energy as a service, where the consumer doesn't make the final investment for his assets, but where he will be able to rent or to pay for a heat service or for mobility or whatever. And this goes, of course, with new business models. We will see, I think, leasing companies offering mobility services on a completely different way than we see it today. And all this is also supported by new technologies. I think about heat pumps, electrical cars, and many other technologies that will evolve. And of course, if you look into markets, this will not be without any influence on the markets, and we can make the distinction between the horizontal markets and the vertical markets, where we see horizontal markets as wholesale market, with the international trading as a very important point. And one of the challenges of electricity markets and also other energy markets is that there are always some constraints in these markets. And Joachim just talked about new capacities for interconnecting countries. Well, today the markets have to take into account limited and constrained capacities between international hubs, which of course is hindering the overall optimization of the resources that we put aligned to deliver and to supply energy to the final customers. So it's a very important point to see how can we facilitate horizontal markets within these constraints, and how can we how can we abolish these constraints? If we talk about vertical markets, it's more about end user supply. We think about how end users will consume energy, and this in the context that it's no longer the case that generation will follow the load, but the load will have to follow generation. When the sun shines, when the wind blows, it's the moment to have to consume cheap energy in order not to overstress the system when the level of generation is rather low. And so we will see in retail different kind of pricing and tarification systems, just to motivate the consumer to adapt his behavior and his consumption pattern, in order to be flexible and to be able to adequate load to generation. So this in what's in scope now for market design and pricing options, well, I don't want to exclude anything, but the main things we are talking about, and this is not only about electricity markets, we also think about gas, emission trading, and other markets that interfere with the energy markets as a whole. We see that there is evolution on economic and regulatory framework. In order to support, for instance, flexibility, you need to adapt regulatory framework to enable and to stimulate flexibility. There's also an economic aspect on that, because if the end consumer is not incentivized economically on an economic basis to change his behavior, there will not be a lot of change, I think, that we can expect from him. As I said, there will be an interaction. We will see the interaction between different markets, and today I think it's very clear. If you see the interaction between the gas market and the electricity market, it's quite obvious that something is going on there. We see also that the emission trading or emission cost influences the electricity price today. So all these factors have to take into account, and if you change something in one market, this can influence another one, and this is very important to anticipate these effects. And then I think that what is also important, because the trends I discussed just a minute ago are quite international, but what is important to us is also that we can implement these trends and these innovations in the Belgian markets. And therefore, it's important to have our industry and our innovative young companies on board, together with our academics and all the brains we have in Belgium to stimulate innovation in the Belgian market. Yeah, some examples, new services from some examples of activities we are planning is new service-oriented business models and the impact on the market of these business models. For instance, as I already said, how will mobility will evolve, heating, and so on. Present market functioning and shortcomings. Well, especially electricity markets are quite complex because these markets are delivering just in time by excellence. If you wait a few minutes with your generation or your load, then this can provoke a great imbalance on the network and can provoke some collapse of the network. So we have to design markets and different slices in the market so that this works all well together just in time. And of course, we see that there can be some flaws and evolutions, and this is clear that we have to work on that and highlight them in order to improve. We discussed a lot in Belgium about, and certainly in Flanders, about digital meters. They are coming now. They bring a lot of advantages and opportunities for the electricity business, and it needs some attention also from data handling, privacy issues. What can we do with the data? Are we creating a data tsunami, or can we manage all this data? It's not so obvious because we see that implementing all the market processes from data side is not so easy and takes a lot of time and IT know-how. And there I have to come back to what Frederick said just in the beginning. We need other profiles than just engineers like we had in the past. Economics, ITers, even legal trained people are very important to understand the whole interaction between different markets. Dynamic pricing, I'm a believer of this feature, and this is more pricing options. Dynamic pricing will enable us to benefit from flexible and just-in-time consumption. Other things where I've been thinking about is now if we talk about pricing, also taxes, TVA. The discussion is very hot in Belgium today, but it will not stop and at the end of the price crisis today. But I think it will be very important to put taxes on the right services or products, so that we can steer a bit into less emission intensive technologies. So that's a bit about what we intend to do in the pillar for market design and pricing options. All your comments and suggestions are of course welcome, also for the other pillars. So we want to interact with our audience to improve this and to let it evolve. We come later back to the exact program that we have in mind on the short term and also on the longer term. But first, I have the pleasure to announce you one of the main Belgian actors of the energy policy, also on European level. Professor Jos Delbeke accepted to share with us his insights and ideas about evolution of the energy market and especially emission trading system. Jos Delbeke is a PhD in economics, which he obtained at the KU Leuven. He worked at the KU Leuven from 77 to 86. Later he joined the European Commission as a Director General of the European Commission's DG Climate Action. Today he's still part-time professor at the European University Institute in Florence, a very nice place, by the way, to be a professor. And he's also EIB chair on climate change policy and international carbon markets. And he's also visiting professor for international and European environment policy. So, Jos, thank you very much to spending some time with us. I understand that you're very busy. I think it's a great opportunity for our audience to hear from you. What are your insights about the energy policies on European level and more specifically emission trading schemes and its evolution? Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hubert. Thanks for the nice words. And I prepared a few slides that are going to be shown. But if we move to the next slide already, the point I wanted to make is that the profession of engineers is absolutely crucial if we want to make the transition that we all are talking about. What I will do in my talk is start with Europe's international strategy, a word on COP26, move to the Green Deal, and then one of the pillars of the Green Deal execution when it comes to climate is the emissions trading system. So that is what I'm going to talk about. Now, what is Europe's international strategy? That's a question that is coming up very frequently because we are at the source of the problem of climate change that we are already seeing. And we know that today's climate change is exactly caused by ourselves. But the climate change of the future is going to be caused primarily by the emerging economies. And we see a major change as of the 1990s, where a new raft of emerging economies joined the industrialized world. Say, let's call it Asia primarily. Let's call it, you know, if we narrow down more, even China. But it is not only China, it's a new wave of industrialization that we see in the world. Now, for that reason, it's very important that we have a multilateral approach. That is that all countries are participating. And that is exactly what the Paris Agreement has been doing. Because before the Paris Agreement, some of you may recall, we had the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol had a flaw, basically, that it was asking questions and policies only from the established industrialized nations. So the Paris Agreement, agreed in 2015, is a very important step forward because it includes into policy action also the emerging economies that are going to be terribly important for our children and grandchildren. That action is coming also from countries like China, the Philippines, Indonesia, Korea, etc., along with the emerging economies of Latin America and ultimately, as we expected, also Africa. So the multilateral approach, the Paris Agreement, is absolutely important. Now, what is Europe's role in that? That is that Europe is at the source of creating the climate problem, and that Europe has seen and defined itself as a laboratory for low carbon technologies and policies. For the obvious reason that we have a specific climate responsibility. And in Belgium, you know, Belgium was the first country of the continent that was digging out hard coal massively out of the underground. Belgium was at the source of the Industrial Revolution, and that is where the climate responsibility clearly started. But at the same time, Europe is also seeing an economic opportunity in having this laboratory established in Europe. And that is where you all, as an engineering community, is possibly serving a very important role. On the next slide, a lot of talk was about COP26. Was it a success or not? Well, I think in a nutshell, what COP26 in Glasgow was doing, it brought us to a world that presumably is going to have a warming around 2 degrees Celsius. From where we still were in Paris, that was a world out of 3 degrees Celsius warming. So that 1 degree Celsius makes a lot of difference. And we can, quarrel whether we are at 1.8 warming, presumably at the end of the century. That is what the International Energy Agency is saying. Or the NGOs had saying we are rather at 2.2, 2.4. Let's not quarrel about that. COP26 was a very important process, and it was started by the EU in 2019 when climate neutrality was announced by 2050 and the target of reducing emissions by 2030 with 55%. And that was setting in motion a trend in the world that was followed primarily by China, because United States came later in 2021 with the election of Biden, because under Trump, the United States left the Paris Agreement, and one of the first decisions of President Biden was to rejoin the Paris Agreement. So I just wanted to indicate that China is an important player, declared itself carbon neutral by 2060. They are undertaking quite a bit of policies already, but of course, China is relying heavily on coal-fired power generation, and so they have a particular problem and responsibility for the future. But China is a continent and it is a big economy, rapidly growing. So every country and every continent has its own particularities and problems. But what was more important even for myself in COP26, that is that particularly difficult countries to join the climate, concerned club of countries were joining and expressing themselves on a long-term goal. Talk about Russia, talk about Turkey or India or Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. They were very difficult to join, but they joined at COP26. And so almost now all G20 countries that are the most important countries responsible for 80% of the emissions in the world now have expressed long-term targets. So that's a good start. But on the next slide, these are all pledges. These are all promises. And what really matters is to have policies in place. And at the next COP in Egypt, in COP27, policies will be reviewed for the coming decade. And I think that's a very important step forward, policies for the 2020s. And that is where we in Europe with the Green Deal are doing, I think, a quite important kind of activity. Now, COP26 brought also a new approach at the multilateral level. And the new approach was to have the groups of countries coming together, a very important, plurilateral approach, that, as it is being called those days, is that we have, for example, South Africa, who is very relying on hard coal, even more than China. More than 90% of electricity production in South Africa is hard coal. It is very closely related to the unions there and the ANC. So they have really a problem at hand. And so they brought together a consortium of industrial players, financiers, and a local policy to build up gradually renewables and to reduce the role of fossil fuels, hard coal, in their energy segment. And so that's a very important step. And that plurilateral approach, being very specific about what needs to be done, that's what we need in this COP context, because, you know, it's all about political rhetoric sometimes. And, you know, people are asking themselves, are these COPs really serving the purpose? I would say yes, but we have to move much more into policies instead of having just declarations. Now, on the next slide, let's move to Europe. In Europe, we define the Green Deal. And what I'm showing in this graph is that the Green Deal is really a very ambitious program. 55% reduction by 2030, measured on 1990, means that we have to double the emission reduction we reached annually between 2005 and 2019, compared to where we have to get by 2030. We have to move from 1.3% annual reduction, which we realized, let's be proud of that, we did that. Our emissions in Europe are now 24% lower than what they were in 1990, but we have to double that annual percentage in order to get at the 55% reduction. So it's really a challenging target. And on the next slide, the Green Deal spells out that it is basically coming down to an investment challenge. And I would like to echo the words that Frédéric was using at the beginning of this session, that we have action now that is faster and broader compared to anything we have seen before. And there were lots of calculations. I think that the European Commission is doing an effort in having all this kind of economic modeling done. And we reckon that 350 billion annual investment additional to what was planned is necessary to reach the challenge. And where is this additional investment going to take place? It's in energy. You know, the debate this morning showed that renewables, obviously storage, the grid, the digital dimension, transport, construction, you know, energy is being used everywhere. But in particular in those sectors, there is going to be a massive rolling out of investments, primarily in Europe, all over Europe, but also in the world at large. We see in transport and in construction, as I mentioned, major rolling out of things we know already. We talk about heat pumps, we talk about electric vehicles, but this energy transport construction nexus is going to improve the technologies we already know fairly well, such as renewables, such as how to optimize the functioning of the electricity market, like Hubert was just mentioning. So it is about improving. But there is still a bit that needs to be done in industry, and that is in hard to abate sectors, as they are called, in steel, in cement, in chemicals, in non-ferrous. In this commodity production, a lot of breakthrough innovations are necessary because they are very carbon intensive. And it is good to build windmills in the sea, but let's come down to the brutal fact that windmills are a combination of steel and chemicals and concrete. So decarbonizing those basic commodities is very important. And we talk there in industry about breakthrough innovations, that it would be very good if we know what kind of winning technologies are going to be there by the end of this decade. We do not reckon that the major reductions in emissions are going to come from industry, but they are going to come from the rolling out of the technology we know already in the energy, transport and construction sector. Industry is now innovating hard. Think about biochemicals, think about hydrogen, new energy carriers, carbon capture and usage and storage. So there is a lot of things going on in industry, but the rolling out of what is necessary is not yet taking place. Now, on the next slide, you know, all this effort that the Green Deal is implying hopes to continue the trend that we have been realizing in Europe and of which we can be proud of. The red line shows up until 2022 where we are as of today, including with the little dip, which was the COVID crisis, that is that we are already on the trend to reduce our emissions. And at the same time, the GDP, economic growth, has been continuing to grow. So economists have been bothering a lot about whether we can afford all this. And I think we can be very affirmative. Yes, we can afford it. We are not going to harm economic growth, but it is about the quality of the economic growth, and it is about the technologies we are going to use into that. So decoupling economic growth of emissions was in the negotiations on the Paris Agreement, where it was so difficult to get the emerging economies on board. This graph made it in the corridors because there was a lot of attention, not least from Asia, from China. How are you doing that, Europe, in bringing down your emissions and in continuing to increase your economic prosperity? Now, on the next slide, I try to explain that climate policy in the EU is not only one instrument. It's really a combination of policy instruments, and I categorize them in three categories: market-based instruments, mandatory regulatory instruments, and governance instruments. The market-based ones, that is mainly, forcing the private actors on the market to come forward with better information, and in market instruments they have to abide with. Putting a price on carbon through taxation or through the ETS has been important, and I will spend a few moments on that in a moment. But another market-based approach that is being made now, that is going to be very important, is the disclosure of climate and sustainable information by private companies and banks. That new regulation on the financing, where accountancy firms will have to come forward with a lot of information that is non-financial, is already creating a raft of intensive activities in the accountancy companies that are supporting private companies. And that is to inform better the shareholder and the stakeholder about what private companies are doing. And that information, that is being requested by the wider public, and that is going to put the private sector even more proactively on a path to sustainability compared to what has been done. Of course, there is a discussion. For those of you who followed the taxonomy discussion, it's all about that. What is sustainable, what is not? Let's not go into that. There is a debate on nuclear, there is a debate on natural gas, on whether that should be included or not included in the green taxonomy. But the essence is the disclosure of much more information by private companies and banks is, accompanying the policy that we already have of putting a price on carbon. And besides that, there are lots of technological standards and benchmarks that have been rolled out already, partly by member states, partly at the European level. Think about the fridges and the freezers standards, or the car standards, or the standards for heat pumps and fluorinated gases in air conditioning, apart from energy efficiency obligations. But these are mainly delegated to member states, because energy efficiency in the north of Europe and the Arctic climate is very different from the Mediterranean climate. And so you cannot regulate that easily out of Brussels. But of course, in the renewables, there are targets that have been set. The target is now being reviewed up to 40% on average in Europe. So on this regulatory standards and benchmarks, a lot is being rolled out, and many of you in the industrial sector are familiar with many of those elements. And then there is a third element, which is the governance. That is the reporting that member states have to perform towards the European authorities. That's not going always that easy. As Belgians, we know the quarreling between the Flanders regions, the Walloon, the Brussels ones, who is doing what, etc. The national energy and climate plans are always very difficult to agree on. There is an update necessary in Belgium but we know the politics, the regionalization of too much of these responsibilities are now haunting us a little bit, including roughly $500 million of euros that is blocked on an account because between the three regions in Belgium, there is no agreement how to share out the efforts, and hence also the revenues coming their way. So there is a raft of climate policies, market-based, regulatory, and governance ones. And on the governance ones, we have shown to be very weak in Belgium. Let's face up to that. We must improve this record. Otherwise, we are not going to be able from many of the funds that are available in Europe. Now, let's move to the real policy on the next slide, because there is a lot of confusion about the percentages. The overall percentage, as I was mentioning, is that Europe has a target of 55% by 2030, measured on 1990. Why 1990? That's the United Nations framework. So every country, every group of countries, the EU is doing that as a group of countries, has to submit its target, how it will operationalize the Paris Agreement. So that's the UN target. But when it comes to policies, we have two blocks of policies in the EU. Basically, what is clearly European, and that is the emissions trading system. And on the other hand, what is not European, let's call it the non-ETS to be simple, and that falls out in the effort sharing and the LULUCF. That is basically forestry. LULUCF is an incredibly difficult abbreviation. I did not invent it myself. It's called land use change, and forestry. So under the LULUCF, we have agriculture and forestry is land use based. The ESR is the effort sharing. And the effort sharing are those emissions that are not managed by the emissions trading system and that are delegated to the member states to perform. And basically, these are the emissions by small polluters, by you and me. When we are using our car to transport services, when we heat our homes, this is falling under the effort sharing. And this effort sharing is a target by the member state. And so far, the target is officially, for example, for Belgium, that we have to reduce 35% by 2030 based on 1990 levels. But this target is now being reviewed because we have a higher 55% target. And so there is roughly on this 35 target at 35%, some 10% on top of that is coming. And that provokes the unrest, as we have been seeing in particular in the Flanders discussions when it comes to developing climate policy. But the climate policy that the Flemish and the Belgians are responsible for is basically buildings, transport, and the traditional ETS emissions, CO2 from agriculture. So that is the responsibility of the regions, and we know how difficult it is. But the particularity of this is that this 40% target under the effort sharing, which is the average of the EU, is based on 2005 figures. And why, you may ask, 2005 figures? Because it is then when the great enlargement of the EU took place. All these former communist countries were incredibly inefficient in the use of their energy. And so they reduced their emissions massively when they become a member. And so we had to change the base year to a more realistic year. And so that's why the figures of the 40% are based on 2005. Now, the 40% is an average for Europe, and around the 40% there is differentiation. The richer your member state is, the more they have to do. And that is, again, one of the discussions that is appearing in the Flemish discussion. You know, why should we do more than a member state like Poland or Romania? But, you know, the brutal reality is that they are much less wealthy than we are. And because they are less wealthy, their emissions are much lower as well. So under the non-ETS, and I'm not going to dwell longer on that, there is a lot of work at the Belgian level, at the member state level, in agriculture, in buildings, and in transport. Let's now concentrate for a moment on the emissions trading system, where the figure that has to be reduced by 2030 is much higher. It is 61%, also measured again on 2005. And who falls under the emissions trading system? It is the power sector, the energy sector, industry, and intra-European aviation. And so on the next slide, I try to explain what the emissions trading is. And basically, it is what economists have been recommending to put a price on carbon, because there is a brutal reality. If you can discharge greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, who pays attention? One only pays attention if you have to pay for it. And in particular, under the ETS sectors, which we are not dealing with the individual consumer, you and me, we have companies, and companies calculate their profits. And so if they have to pay for their emissions, they are going to economize on their emissions. And that is what it is happening. Now, today, the emissions trading system is covering all major installations in energy and the manufacturing industry, some 10,000 installations, and they are treated exactly in the same manner all over Europe. So to explain, there is a lot of discussion about the Port of Antwerp. The Port of Antwerp, these are major industrial installations. They are governed through the ETS at European level. So the Flemish authorities have no direct say in what the obligations are from those companies. They are in fact implementing the European rules. Of course, they can support the companies with innovation support. That's something different. But the obligations to reduce CO2 emissions falls under a European system. And that's why, thank God we have a European system, there are no quarrels between what is happening in the Port of Antwerp or the Port of Rotterdam or Hamburg or Marseille, or, all companies in these sectors are treated exactly in the same manner in Europe. And so there is under the ETS a cap that is being defined, and I come to that in a minute, that is being reduced downwards. Now, what we have done so far in the EU is that we reduced already by today the emissions of the covered companies with 43%. So what we still have to do is to improve the system in emission reductions from 43% to 61%. 61% being negotiated. It's not yet entirely done. It's on the table of the negotiators, but that's the proposal by the Commission, that, to be in line with the 55%, the emissions under the ETS have to reduce by 61%, and we have already approached and done 43%, which is absolutely fascinating. And the ETS sectors have been the drivers of the emission reductions in Europe. Now, on the next slide, I try to explain how the system is working. We have caps that are being set in line with the 55%, and this cap setting are done over different periods. So we started in 2005, and now we are under the cap managed by the Paris Agreement, and that is officially submitted to the United Nations. We are in the Paris, in the National Determined Commitment 1, to be formally precise, from 2021 to 2030. And on the next slide, what I'm indicating is that every year the emissions are going down, the allowed emissions, to be precise, under the cap are going down with a slight percentage. Today, legally, the percentage is that every year the total amount of allowances available in Europe is going down by 2.2%. and to be in line with the 61% that is still being on the negotiation table, it's going to be increased from 2.2% to 4.2%. So you see on the last blue shaded lines that these lines are going to go down much more pronounced. It's not yet agreed to what extent, when is going to be done, what, that's part of the negotiations, but you can reckon that we will have to double the annual emission reductions from roughly from 2.2% now to roughly around 4%. The debate is open whether it's going to be precisely 4.2 or rather 4 or 4.8, etc., etc. I do not want to annoy you with these details. Now, on the next slide, what is very important is that there is 55% of the allowances that are available for the companies under the ETS. 55% is being auctioned. So on the energy exchange of Leipzig, the EEX, companies can buy their allowances, and all power companies have to buy all allowances to pay for the emissions they are originating from their installations. So the auctioning revenues are becoming very important. We reckon that last year, roughly around 50 billion euros has been raised through auctioning, and these revenues go to the member states. And that is exactly those revenues that are blocked in Belgium, the $500 million that I'm talking about, that are up for quarrel between the Flanders, the Walloon, and the Brussels regions, you know, on who gets what. And as they cannot agree, it stays on a savings account, which is a shame because a lot of this money is being used for innovation support and could be used in a very helpful manner. The other 45% is given for free to companies that are particularly suffering from international competition. And the free allocation goes massively to 3-4 sectors: to steel, to cement, to chemicals such as fertilizers, and to non-ferrous metals such as aluminum. And so this free allocation is going to be reduced gradually, and we come to that in a moment, but this free allocation represents quite a little bit of money. On the next slide, you know, what many of you may be familiar with is that the prices under the ETS has gone up, and through some would say have gone through the roof. As we speak, the prices paid today are around 80 euros per ton of CO2. Now, this is quite significant if you compare it to 1 year ago, and if you in particular compare it to, say, since 2018, the last 3-4 years, where prices were not coming beyond the 10 euros per ton of carbon. So what means the 80 euros? That means that it is becoming, as Hubert was saying, a very important element of the pricing of electricity, for example. It determines fuel switching between gas and coal in particular, but given the animosity on energy markets, you know, that fuel switching is a bit under pressure, but it's a very important price level because historically the use of coal has been going down spectacularly in Europe and in the east of Europe in particular. Now, more importantly is this 80 euros make a lot of new technologies profitable. Carbon capture and storage, according to the best, you know, options, is already in the range of the 80 euros per ton. And the question that many of the people have is this price going to stay? Is it, you know, a price where we can fear that the price level is going to tumble down to the 10 euros that we saw in 2017? I would say forcefully that price is not going to go down to the 10 euros because we created in the market the market stability reserve So we can expect prices to remain fairly high. I'm not going to say that prices cannot go down from 80 euros to 70 euros or 60 euros. We have seen a peak in the prices up to 19 euros. So it's a market. It's going to fluctuate. But I think that we have reached a new normal. That is that the new normal is that the prices are going to stay in a range between 60 and say 100 euros. And that is exactly what economists such as Stern and Stiglitz, in a famous World Bank report, have been saying we should be in for having a useful price signal for managing the carbon policy that we are currently having. On the next slide, I'm indicating that there is also part of the money that is going to European funds. On the next slide, please. On the European funds, the sponsoring innovation, the ETS Innovation Fund is today the biggest innovation fund around in Europe. There is a research fund, but innovation goes to private companies for first of a kind investments. And CCS is being financed now massively. And also the modernization fund that is being used particularly in the east of the European Union. On the next slide, let's concentrate on what is happening today. And I would like to concentrate on two elements. The first is international competitiveness. Because with these high carbon prices, our companies are starting to complain. Are we not shooting ourselves in the foot and making our commodities very difficult to export? And do we not facilitate imports? So far, we used free allocation for that. I explained that free or allowances, certificates are handed over to companies for free. But yes, this is good enough. The consensus is growing that we need something stronger. And for that reason, the Commission has proposed a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is in fact a tax for commodities coming in to Europe, carbon intensive commodities. Steel, cement are the two primary ones, but also fertilizer. Electricity, a little bit at the border in the Balkans and in the north of Africa. So these are the sectors that are currently covered by the proposal. It's a proposal by the Commission. It's not yet a law. It will take some time to negotiate, but it is proposed that it would enter into force by 2026 and that we would try out the system and talk to our international partners before. Lots of hot debates around this. This is going to raise money. Where are the revenues going to go to? This is going to raise a number of technical issues because importing steel, say from China, where carbon policy is comparable or not comparable to the European ones, I would say it's not comparable. But to what extent is it comparable, not non-comparable? So there is going to be a lot of technical issues, MRV issues, monitoring, reporting, and verification issues. And so unless if these are solved, the companies enjoying the benefits of free allocation, and with the current allowances and the prices of them, this free allocation is massive. We talk, billions in a year. Those companies say, we have to keep the free allocation. And, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, is saying you cannot have it both. You cannot have and free allocation and a carbon border adjustment. So there is going to be quite a number of debates on these. And yesterday, Olaf Scholz, the new German chancellor, in Davos, announced a kind of alternative, or is it a complement, who knows, to the carbon border adjustment mechanism that would be the formation of carbon clubs, where a number of countries would say we do similar policies, and because we do similar policies, we are not going to tax each other's products. So it's a new concept. So the debate is evolving as we speak. It's very active, but the carbon border adjustment mechanism is giving one signal. Europe saying, okay, we go for expensive technologies to decarbonize our economy, but there should be a kind of fair playing ground with other parts of the world not doing something similar. And on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and with the products proposed by the Commission, 2-3 regions are particularly heavily hit. And these are border regions to the EU. We talk about Russia and we talk about Turkey. We talk a little bit about North Africa, Morocco, etc. But it is Turkey and Russia, 2 players on our border that are not particularly easy to deal with. Nota bene for China, because people think always about China, you know, the Chinese are rolling out an ETS system that is a blueprint, or that where the European system was used as a blueprint. So on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, you know, there is going to be quite some debate, not least at the high political level. So that's the proposal on the table. Lots of things happening. We will see how it is going to pan out. On the next slide, there is also another important proposal, and that is to extend the carbon price to more sectors in the economy. For the maritime sector and international aviation, you know, the international partners are already raising their flags, but, you know, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is helping, you know, in making the point, you know, if you are not doing serious policies, you know, you will have to pay for that. But the most important is that now a new ETS system is being proposed for heating and transport fuels. That means that gas and oil that is being used massively in heating and transport, that is so far the responsibility for the member states under the effort sharing directive, then there would be also the incremental development of an ETS system over time. That could facilitate the rolling out of the electric vehicle, for example, because if you think it through, the electric vehicle is paying for its carbon emissions because the use of the electric vehicle needs electricity, and electricity falls under the ETS. Now, we do not see something similar for gasoline and for petrol and for the heating oil that we are using in, and the gas we are using for heating our buildings. So there is a little bit, you know, if you switch to electric applications like on heat pumps, you pay again through the ETS for your electricity and for the carbon emissions related to that electricity, which is not the case when you go for a classic heating boiler, a gas heating boiler in particular. So the ETS2 system, it's going to be a separate system, but it's going to converge with the normal ETS over time. There is not yet a specific timetable, but of course, this is increasing the price for consumers on gasoline, on diesel, and of course, politically, that's very sensitive. Think about the Gilets jaunes in France. You know, we are going to see more of that. But the most important is that this ETS2 system would create a lot of funds for a new social climate fund that would be used to increase energy efficiency of buildings, in particular of social housing and the similar projects. So this social climate fund would be a fund that is helping those who are suffering the most from fuel poverty. And so it's a bit of a channeling around of resources to help the poorest energy users in their electricity use. On the next slide, I wanted to call or recall that there is also a voluntary carbon market that is in full development. Voluntary carbon markets are voluntary. So that means when a company says we are going to be net zero by 2050, 2030, or whatever date, they are going to offset part of their emissions through buying certificates from those who are doing more. In the nature solution, those financing the Amazon, for example. So the voluntary carbon market is very voluntary, but there is some interest in particular through the net zero targets that companies are declaring themselves to go for. And so this is mainly an issue developing outside Europe, because we have an ETS and we are expanding the ETS. But in other parts of the world, there is not a similar ETS. We have an ETS coming on stream in China, in Canada, in New Zealand, in Korea. That's similar to the European system, in California. But we do not see in the rest of the United States, we do not see in Latin America, we do not see in Africa, etc., similar, and in Asia, efforts coming, but the voluntary carbon market is developing there. Think about Brazil saying we have the Amazon, pay us and we are going to maintain the carbon forest that is in the Amazon, and so pay us for that. And this is in the context of the voluntary carbon markets. It's growing. People expect a tremendous growth. It's still very tiny today, but I just wanted to bring it to your attention that internationally, the carbon pricing idea is being followed through, either through ETS systems like we have in Europe, or through voluntary carbon instruments in which Europe is a little bit less engaged. So on the next slide, let's come to some conclusions. And I look forward to some of the questions that you may have. On the Green Deal, what we are seeing is that we have a market-based approach that is deepened through the ETS, through the new ETS, and of course we have normal energy taxation at the pump, etc. So we are directly and indirectly paying for our carbon increasingly in Europe. And part of the market approach is also the mandatory disclosure of sustainable and climate information by companies in the financial sector and industrial corporations. So the market is being used to deliver and to pay for the externality, which is climate and other sustainability concerns. The second element is that the Green Deal is a massive investment program. And so a lot of funds are being created through the EU budget, through the COVID crisis, Next Generation EU Fund, through the ETS revenues, through the Innovation, the Modernization Fund, and the Social and the Just Transition Fund. I did not mention the Just Transition Fund. That is where in coal regions like Silesia, there is a transformation of the economy going on, a little bit less of importance for us. But, a lot of money is available to finance the Green Deal, because a lot of money is necessary to finance the massive investment program that it is basically representing. And as was said by all speakers before me, energy is key, because climate change is primarily less use of fossil fuels. And so whatever we do in the energy sector, in particular in the renewables, storage, the digital, etc., is very important, and managing the flexibility that is increasing through the use of renewables is very important. And energy efficiency obviously is a very important one. We have there a lot of work to do. I was not going into that, but existing buildings in Europe and in particular in Belgium is the real headache. And so renovation of those buildings is really what should be done as part of the elements of the climate and the EU Green Deal. So I wanted to give you a flavor of what is on the table. The Green Deal is an economic policy program, but pricing is becoming a key element only, and not only, but as is indicated by the high price that is currently part of the pricing debate we see in several energy price debate we see in several member states of the EU. I leave it there, and I'm open for any questions that you may be having.
Yes, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the presentation. It was really interesting on my part, on my behalf. So we did indeed get some questions in. So I'll maybe directly start with the first one that we got in. It's on the investment needs. So you mentioned that we need, or that the estimation is about 350 billion of additional investment needs. I think you touched upon it a few times during the presentation, but yeah, where do we get this money from? Could you just wrap it up? Where do we get this money from, and do we see maybe there possibly an impact on the GDP and the energy prices?
Well, most of the financial resources are going to come from the private sector. That's why this disclosure of non-financial information by the private sector is so important. Of course, the private sector has the logic of profits and profitability. And so that is where public revenues can tilt the balance in favor of those investments. That is where the Next Generation EU, for example, these are projects that the member states had to submit to the EU. 38% of those projects must show a relationship to climate and sustainability, and blending the funds, private and public, that is what is needed to happen. Now, that is, for example, for Belgium, so important. I heard lately Thomas Dermin, who is the state secretary responsible for that, underlining a lot of this, win-win solutions when it comes to energy use, energy efficiency, the energy sector in a part of the proposals they have been using, but it is blending. It cannot be all public funds. It is, matching the private, pressurizing the private to come forward, and adding it up and tilting the balance, for the need for those technologies that are not yet ripe for being taken up by the market.
Yeah. All right. And then maybe...
Of course, you mentioned as well the energy price crisis that we are currently going through. There was some debate, in particular, whether the ETS system is having an impact on the energy prices and the electricity prices in particular. Of course it does. Let's not be kidding, it does. But it is not more than 10-15% of the price increase that we have been seeing. It's obvious if the certificates go from 10 euros to 80 euros that there is a price impact. That's also the purpose of it. So let's face it, that's normal. But the bulk, the 80-90% is, of course, related to international factors. International prices for gas in particular, LNG, etc., etc. So there is a bit of upheaval there. But what the Commission has been saying and recommending to all member states is to use the revenues from the ETS to alleviate energy poverty that is currently happening. And the drama of Belgium is that these revenues from the ETS are blocked on a savings account, and it cannot be used neither by the Flanders, the Walloon, or the Brussels region. And that is a bit dramatic, that in other countries, in France, in Spain, in Germany, elsewhere, the revenues from the ETS are being used to reduce fuel poverty as a specific and targeted tool. But in Belgium, it is not happening. Hence, we are stuck in a VAT/excise debate, etc. That is then complicated by the federal and the regional level. Let's not go into that. But ETS has an impact. But the ETS revenues can be used and are being used by most of the member states in the EU to reduce the energy poverty that it may create.
Yeah, that's also directly linked to another question, I think, is we have this possibly, or this slight increase in energy prices. Do you believe, or do you fear that it might, let's say, deconvince or not aid in convincing the public of the emission reduction that we want if this provokes unaffordable prices in the future, or the fear of unaffordable prices?
Well, I do agree that this is not helpful for the debate. It's a complicating factor. We see that in Belgium. but it is all over Europe. You know, let's talk about Poland, for example. Poland has a lot of coal in its power generation, so the impact of the ETS on electricity prices for the consumer is much higher in Poland than it is in our member states. So there is a debate, and it is not going to facilitate the discussion. But at the same time, what we are facing up to is that we have to double down on the efforts that need to be done. If we can have the social housing, I think that is where we have been negligent in Belgium in particular on a lot of social housing, schools, public buildings that are relatively bad in their energy performance. You know, if we would tackle them and use the funds that are being offered by the EU through the European Investment Bank and all this kind of vehicles, that would help the transition that we have to go through. It's, you know, we are a very energy dependent continent. Roughly on the back of the envelope before the high energy prices, I did not do the calculations again. Every day in Europe, we pay 1 billion euros for the import of fossil fuels. Every day. It's around 320 billion that we are paying collectively in the EU. And that was before the price hike, you know, that we are currently seeing, say with prices of a year, 2 years ago. It's official estimate by Eurostat, you can trace that. So we are importing so much. So if we could do more on our territory, and that is what we could do through solar panels and, you know, the windmills in the sea, the floating windmills is an incredible important innovation. Because we are no longer tied to sandbanks and things like that. We can build windmills and big windmills in the high sea, you know, so we are good on that in Belgium. We have leading technology, leading companies. So if we double down on this, I think it should be a win-win. But politics is very short-termish, you know, and that is where the debate may suffer a little bit of this. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. All right. Thank you. Then maybe a completely different question. So for a lot of cost benefit analysis and to decide where to go for certain investments or not, the societal price of CO2 is used as a benchmark. Do you believe that the ETS price would be a good reference to justify investments?
I think it does. I think that the question that is being raised now, are the prices going to stay at the level they are? You know, what is the long-term perspective? Yep. I think that all market observers would say that the price is going to stay in that neighborhood or will go up further, which may create another problem. You know, the political acceptability, say if the prices would go. Some economists are saying we need prices of 200 euros or 300 euros. You know, the political acceptability would be relatively problematic because with those high ETS prices, you know, our commodities would be priced out of the market unless we go for hydrogen-based steel or biochemicals used in our chemical products, etc., etc. So, and I think that is happening, you know. But we are in the transition, you know, we are not yet there. We have the first indications that this is happening. And then comes the question, if we have hydrogen-based steel, for example, where and how is the hydrogen going to be produced? Are we going to do it ourselves? Are we going to import it? You know, but I'm truly believing that the trade balance of Europe is profoundly changing with the energy transition. We will import much less fossil fuels. Official estimates by the European Commission used in the impact analysis is that as of 2030, 2035, we see a drop of more than 50% of import of this fossil fuel product. But, you know, in exchange, we are going to import more minerals to have the batteries and the, you know, the new equipment, the new grid, the new, you know, digital equipment that needs to be brought forward, you know, to have these, you know, substituted. So less raw materials, but more or less energy products, but more raw materials that is necessary for the making the new products that we are going to use. So the trade balance is expected to change dramatically. And in my new function at the EUY in Florence, I'm giving training to G20 countries. And I'm absolutely surprised how few things are happening in countries like Russia, but how many things are happening in the Middle East. Say Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, United Arab Emirates, you know, they are all going for green hydrogen. And I see that now also Africa, the rest of Africa is wakening up to that. Latin America, so also lithium mines and, you know, all this kind of new products that we were hardly thinking 5 years ago are now really, and you see it on the stock exchange, you know, that the companies engaged in this are really making good business.
All right, all right. And I have a question that's also directly linked to this ETS prices. Yeah, the high peak that we are seeing right now. Yeah, you've mentioned it just in your answer previously. But do you believe it will that it will last, or is it just a short-term crisis due to that is gas-driven? But
I would not think it's a short-term crisis. I think we stay. This is the new normal. By indication, the new German government has, as part of the government agreement, that the ETS prices cannot go below 60 euros. So that's an indication of where, you know, in the way things develop, people are, you know, it's very difficult to speculate. You know, I'm not speculating. I'm not giving any, you know, exact price indications. But, you know, I think in the range 60 to 100 euros, you know, we should plan for that, you know, and it's going to stay there.
All right, all right. Well, then I had a question about, but you answered it in one of your last slides on the ETS system that we have in Europe, whether similar systems are being put in place or are emerging, might emerge in different countries or continents. And you mentioned something on that, California, Canada, China also emerging. Maybe I'll change my question to, do you believe that in the upcoming years or decades, we might evolve to a system where we have not only a European or continental or by country level, but an overarching level where we have an ETS system that is more global?
I truly think that is going to be the case, but I'm not saying we are going to have one unique global carbon price, but we are moving to a system that is going to be connected one way or the other. And the voluntary carbon markets could play the role of a lubricant between different ETS constituencies. Now, Mexico, for example, Argentina, Colombia, they are going for ETS systems as well. They are not yet there. The lesson we learn from our European system, and we have been for a decade present very much helping our Chinese colleagues to set up the system, and their system is similar to the European system now, is that you need a good governance system. You know, you have to know your installations, you have to trace emissions, you have to have a good MRV system, monitoring, reporting, verification. And that is what the Chinese gradually succeed in doing. You know, they are not yet there. It took us also a decade in Europe to have the system really trustworthy and up and running. But the Chinese are going very systematic, very step by step. And what we are now observing is the rollout of a national Chinese, you know, ETS system that is bigger than the European system. So our European system is a multi-billion market, but the prices that are being paid already today in China are higher than the prices we paid on our ETS 5 years ago. So it's moving very, very fast, and China is a continent, and for that reason, I think the Chinese entering the game is really a game changer. My biggest disappointment is that the idea of carbon pricing comes from the United States, and that the United States repeatedly failed to introduce a carbon pricing system. And that is going to complicate tremendously the carbon border adjustment mechanism debate, because the Chinese may say, we have a carbon pricing system and we can tune up the price, you know, and we can play around with it, while the United States is not having the beginnings of a carbon pricing system, which is really unfortunate. They had it for sulfur, they still have it for sulfur. It worked very well. In fact, our system in the EU is a bit of a variation of that sulfur trading system of the United States. But, you know, that is where, you know, we are really unfortunate to see if the United States would join the club, then China, EU, United States, this is half of the emissions of the world. Then we could go to a global carbon price. But unless the United States follows through, you know, it remains a dream.
Yeah, let's hope indeed in the future that it might evolve that way then. Okay, thank you very much, Jos. Thank you very much for your intervention today. I really believe it was very interesting also for everyone who is attending. So in the next slide, I will give the word to Danielle. Danielle, who is sorry, Jos, you want to?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for your attention, and you can share the slides with your membership, so no problem. And on the last slide, there is a book I did with my colleague Peter Vis, whom you can, you know, download for free through open access. So for those who want to have specific elements, that is the legislation as it stands as of today, you know. So,
all right.
So thank you very much. It was my real pleasure to be with you this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jos. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day. Thank you.
All right. So Danielle, I want to give you the floor to briefly go over the program that we foresee for 2022-2023. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Joachim. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me now present the program for 2022 and 2023. For the next 2 years, our ambition is to organize several events based on the 4 already announced pillars. You see on the slide the 4 pillars: electricity production, decarbonize the load, market design and pricing option, and energy outlook and legislative packages. What is foreseen for electricity production is a study day about high voltage and medium voltage substation. Also a study day about digital substation, automation and control. And hopefully a study day about HVDC system combined with a site visit on HVDC substation. We would like also to speak about small modular reactor, which is a very actually subject, and speak about the Belgian generation mix and renewable energy generation strategy. About decarbonization of the load, we would like to speak about flexible load and consumer centricity. We would like to have a study day about industrial decarbonization of the load. Also a site visit, probably Energieville, about industrial and residential load. Would like also to speak about e-mobility, electrification of the fleets, and to speak about carbon capture projects in Belgium. We know that there are some projects in the North Sea zone in Ghent, and this is the subject we would like to speak about. About the market design and pricing option, we will have a study day about new concept for electricity pricing, and also some workshop about flexibility on the market and new model, business model probably with a site visit on trade the trade market site. About energy outlook, we'll have a webinar about long-term energy outlook and EU policy, about EU package for Fit for 55, and also a webinar about the Belgian transition and policy. Last but not least, we will have other events like the presentation of the academic research program with university, and this conference will be probably set up in May. For all these subjects, I invite you to connect us to propose any contribution or suggestions you would like to introduce for these topics. The next event already foreseen from our organization is the study day about high voltage and medium voltage substation. This study day has been delayed 2 times from 2020. Unfortunately, today, it is again difficult to confirm the format of this event due to the sanitary situation. Please keep close for more information during February. But for the moment, at the moment, it is foreseen on the 25th of February in Elia, and we hope to meet you at this networking event. The speakers are already known. You see the list on the slide, and we hope very heartily to be sure that we will perform the study day on February. Next program concerns the new concept for electricity pricing. This study day was foreseen end of 2021, and it has also been delayed to the 1st of April. The program is already known. You see the list of the speakers that are foreseen, and of course, we hope firmly to invite you to meet us on the 1st of April. So this is for the program. 2 study days already confirmed, but subject to the situation of the sanitary conditions. And you know what we will propose to you for the next 2 years, and hopefully I hope to meet you all during the next 2 years. Joachim or Frédéric, I give you the floor for the conclusions.
Thank you, Daniel. I think it was a quite interesting webinar today. My thanks again to Jos Delbeke, and it was quite inspiring and knowledgeful presentation. I appreciate it a lot. I hope that's also the case for all the people attending today, and big thanks for that. Like you see, we plan to reorganize the organization, and I think there is 4 pillars which are quite interesting for us in the energy transition. Then just become a member if you are not yet a member. That's what I would advise. If you look for information, we have the website. We have there all the contact details. If you want to get in touch with us, we are also available to explain more our program and the way we want to go. Also to explain it in your company if it's needed, just ask for that. We can organize something special for that. Then I would say thank you for attending and see you next time. Thank you. Bye bye.